The following interview was conducted as a part of a project by the Madison County Military Heritage Commission to inform and enlighten young people and the community as a whole about the sacrifices made by those in the military on battlefields around the world. We wish to thank the Huntsville School System and the Lehigh Broadcast Center for their help in presenting this Military Heritage Program.
Hello, I'm Tom Kellemer. Welcome to our program. Today we'll be talking with Steve Milburn, who served 2 tours in Vietnam with the U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam's U.S. Army Advisory Team with the Vietnamese Army Rangers. He was awarded the Silver Star, a Bronze Star with Valor, and an Army Commendation Medal with Valor for gallantry in action while serving with both the 32nd and 44th Ranger Battalions, respectively. Steve Milburn was inducted into the Madison County Hall of Heroes in 2005. Steve, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, sir.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate the opportunity.
Appreciate your time. Now, before we get into questions regarding your military service, tell us a little about yourself. You're born in Missouri, right?
I was, Joplin, and my parents had a little farm just outside of Joplin, and shortly after that, World War II went to full flame. And my dad went out to Hollywood to write scripts for the propaganda movies that we were making at the time,
Really?
Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer.
Right. Now, you come from a big family, a lot of siblings?
No, just had one sister, and she's now passed away.
Steve, how long did you stay in the Army, and what did you do following your time in service?
Well, I stayed with the active duty Army for 20 years, and then I went into industry for a while, and then came back to do what I was trained to do, and that was do Army training, Army targetry, and I worked for the United States government as a employee.
Before we go any further now, you have 2 daughters, I believe, is that right?
I have 2 daughters and 2 sons, and they unfortunately are scattered all over the United States, Moscow, Idaho, and Reno, Nevada, Dallas, Texas, and then of course I have one son at Lake Tahoe who wrote me a letter when he first got there and said, I'm a ski patrol officer and I can't believe they're paying me to do this.
Yeah. Now, you started out as an enlisted man, right?
I did, sir.
Yeah.
And part of my reason for coming into the Army was to get some training. I dropped out of college my freshman year, and I was aware that if you didn't have training, you weren't going to be much in life. So the United States Army offered an opportunity towards that end.
And talk about becoming an officer. What prompted that exactly?
Well, actually, I had a senior non-commissioned officer that drove me to it. He kept after me and kept after me to go to OCS. Yeah. And I often thought that it was going to be a credit to the company, the organization, for having a candidate,
right,
fill the quota.
Right.
But as it turned out, it was just a gesture on his part that he had a lot of interest in my future and took good care of me.
Good. And talk about being away from home while you were in the military. Did that pose a hardship for your family?
Well, of course, anytime you're away from your family, there's a hardship simply because you're away. And for me, I had overseas tours, and I'll give you an example. I was en route to Vietnam, and I had left early. When I got to the folks down in the Panama Canal, they found out I knew how to build ranges. So they had me building their quick kill range, which is a starburst type range where everybody starts at the center and walks out. Yeah. And they kept me there for almost 6 months. So I got to Vietnam in December of 1968, when I should have been there like in August.
I see. You had a calling there for a while, didn't
Yes.
you? Yeah. I'm sure you formed lasting friendships in the service. Do you still stay in contact with any of your friends?
I do, and as a matter of fact, I have one friend that just contacted me to celebrate an anniversary that we shared, and he had written a book. A guy's named Dave Taylor, and he wrote a book about the U.S. Army 23rd Infantry Division battalion that he was with. And I'll be sharing that book with the military heritage folks.
Good, good, good. Steve, when you had some free time, however little that was, what did you do for relaxation in Vietnam? Did you have a chance to see any movies or that sort of thing? What did you do for relaxation?
Well, Tom, it's interesting because there's an opportunity to embellish here. Rangers went out for a month at a time, but our months were counted in Ranger days, so that was only about 22, 23 days.
Mm-hmm.
The other days were the couple of days beforehand when you were gearing up and getting your supplies, and the couple of days at the end when you were standing down.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, we did get to drive into the compounds, the U.S. compounds, and we did get to watch a movie or two. One that sticks with me is the movie Zulu, where the British soldiers were standing up against very aggressive warriors. While we were watching that movie, mortar rounds started dropping in on the theater. They had zeroed in and knew they had about 150 guys inside this little makeshift theater.
Wow.
And so that was a real surprise. Nobody was hurt that I'm aware of. They all blew up on the roof.
They could have made a movie right there.
Could
Right
have.
Now, what about mail call? How often did you get mail?
Well, actually, we got mail just about every time that somebody flew something out. So if you were getting rations or ammunition, they would be dropping a mail bag. I was surprised one time when the Class A agent, which is a fellow that comes around to pay people, came to the field and handed me a bag of backlogged letters. So I had about 30 letters all at one time from my family and my wife and everything.
Yeah. And how long did it take usually to get a letter from home?
About 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Not bad turnaround. I recall one time writing on a C ration, and all you had to do is write your letter. Didn't require any postage. Hand it to a helicopter pilot, and it would literally get to the United States in a week.
I remember in my time in service, mail call was always one of the most popular times, and I'm sure that's the way
Big
it was.
morale booster.
Yeah, it was. It really was. Of course, no cell phones at the time, but did you occasionally get to talk on the phone with your family back home?
Well, to be perfectly frank, the only time I got to talk back to the States was when I was in the hospital at Camp Zama, Japan, recovering from one of my wounds. So there wasn't any telephone conversation out of Vietnam for us.
What's your favorite memory, Steve, from serving in the Army with the Rangers?
Well, actually, I think my pride in the way the Vietnamese Rangers were able to integrate with the total effort in Vietnam, so that there wasn't any disparity. It wasn't Americans and it wasn't Vietnamese and it wasn't Koreans, because we served with the Koreans also. Everybody worked together like a finely tuned machine, and that impressed me because, as you well know, the United States Army is a team.
Right.
And the Vietnamese Army was a team, and we integrated our teams.
Explain exactly what you did as an advisor with the Vietnamese Army Rangers.
I was the link between American assets and the Vietnamese battalion with which I served. I had an opportunity to both be an assistant advisor where I could participate in the tactics, or as a senior advisor where I helped with the command and control of the battalion. And that gave me opportunities to talk to the U.S. Air Force, the Vietnamese Air Force, U.S. Marines, because they had the big 8-inch howitzers, the big guns. And then, of course, the Navy Corsairs were always wonderful to see coming in across the treetops.
Now, this a typical day, would you like before daybreak, and would you stay out 2 or 3 days? How did that go?
Well, we stayed out. It was a continuous patrolling operation. We called them sweeps. And in the context of a sweep, you'd leave where you had spent the night. We called them RONs, or remain overnight. One of the things I became notorious for was I like to shoot a lot of artillery. And so every day before we left, the night before, I'd done pre-plans in case we were attacked. But as we were getting ready to leave, I'd shoot those pre-plans and kind of clear the perimeter from from anybody that might be watching us.
Right.
We'd go out and patrol all day. We'd take a break for lunch, about an hour and a half, because we had to cook everything that we had and heat our rice. And then in the evening, about 4 o'clock in the evening, we'd close into the RON and set up our defensive positions. So that was day after day after day.
Did you learn to like Vietnamese food, or did you eat a lot of that?
I ate a lot of it, and I was just telling my wife the other day about the little peppers. Soldiers would pick these little red peppers, and then they'd put them in everything. And the logic was, rice is bland, but you got to do something to spice it up. And it was hot.
Did you speak fluent Vietnamese?
I did, and that was thanks to what they called the MATA course at Fort Bragg. MATA was the Military Assistance Command's training course for officers enlisted, And if you graduated from MATA, you could speak enough Vietnamese to get along. And after you were in Vietnam and started working with your counterparts, you gained enough in reading and writing to get along also.
Mm-hmm. Steve, you were awarded our country's third highest medal for valor, the Silver Star. Tell us about the battle or combat action that led to you receiving this medal.
I'm often asked about that, and one of the things that I emphasize is I didn't go into the battle thinking I was doing anything brave. I was thinking I was doing my job and participating with the team. This was an ambush. It was a battalion-sized ambush, and it was something called a horseshoe ambush, where we had people in front of us and on each side of us. There were lots of casualties. And my first instinct was, let's get out there, because part of my job was to make sure casualties were evacuated and to make sure that the assets, artillery and air power, were brought to bear on the enemy. Mm-hmm. In that particular case, it was a battle that lasted 32 hours. We got about roughly 40 odd some Vietnamese bodies on the battlefield, which is unusual because they usually drug them off and removed them. Mm-hmm. It turned out that we were fighting against a Viet Cong battalion that was being reinforced by a North Vietnamese Army advisory group. Mm-hmm. So it was a tedious battle, and one of the things that really made me appreciate the Air Force was they responded almost immediately. They stayed with me. I can mention something that I really, really think is important. There was an airship called Spooky, and it had a howitzer. It had a 20-millimeter Cannon Gatling gun, and it had 50 caliber machine guns. And if a Spooky came on station for you, if you could identify where the enemy was, they weren't there after the passes from the Spookies.
What part of Vietnam was this?
Well, the interesting thing about Rangers is a Ranger battalion could serve anywhere in the 4 corps of Vietnam. I spent most of my time down in 4 Corps or the Canal Peninsula.
I see. Now share with us, or who prepared you, Steve, to take the actions you did in that situation?
Well, obviously I'd already gone through infantry training. I'd been in infantry training for a lot of years. Mm-hmm. The activities were part of my training at the MATA course and the being able to talk Air Force talk. Mm-hmm. And to talk the Marine Corps talk for adjusting artillery. Mm-hmm. And I say that with a little levity, because if you don't know the slang and can't communicate with those guys, they take a long time to respond. But if you know the slang, they're Johnny on the spot. They're right there with what you need.
Right. How would you describe to young people what it's like to serve in a war zone? The thoughts you have of possibly being killed or wounded during a battle?
Well, one of the questions I'm often asked is, were you afraid? And I kind of make a discrimination between afraid and scared. Afraid is something that you think about beforehand, and you probably won't do what you're thinking about. Mm-hmm. If you're scared, you start out scared, but then it just melts into doing your job. Mm-hmm. And that's what I did. I did my job. Yeah.
And you weren't just thinking, well, you're always thinking, how can I get out of this alive, or hopefully you can make it out.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, you were wounded twice in Vietnam. Steve, talk a little about that.
Well, I'll highlight the fact that the bullets aren't yours, in the sense that there's a snap and a pop when they, high-powered rifle bullet goes past your ear. If you are wounded, you can't hear the snap or the pop. Right. So you're always hopeful that you keep hearing the snaps and the pops, because you're down low and you're avoiding the exposure. Mm-hmm. In my particular case, I was in an area. We were doing a recovery on a downed aircraft. We were trying to help the pilot who was badly wounded and get the machine guns off and the ammunition off. And they'd had an opportunity to set up the mortars. The Viet Cong set up the mortars and brought mortar fire down on us. Mm-hmm. And I was wounded and had a bad wound to my hand. I thought I was going to get out and return home. And I said to the doctor, well, I can't go back to the field. I don't have any trigger finger. He said, don't worry about it. We sewed it back on.
It's an interesting story about this. Steve, tell us about how you were wounded, like part of your knuckle had to be replaced. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. They rebuilt my knuckle for me, and I can do just about everything.
Mm-hmm. And tell us about, it involved a ricochet. Explain that for us.
the mortar rounds came from afar, and they dropped down on us, and they were exploding, and I was spread with fragments from a mortar round. But the bullet that got my knuckle was a ricochet off of a bumper. It was what they call a spent
Off
round.
of a Jeep bumper, I
Off
think.
of a
Yeah.
Jeep
Wow.
bumper. And so I ended up with the worst wound off of something that shouldn't have really been deadly.
Yeah. And you had mortar or shrapnel wounds?
Yeah, I had about 13 fragments in me.
How long did you have to stay in the hospital for both those wounds?
First time was, let's see, 6 weeks, and then 6 more weeks, 12 weeks, about 12 weeks. And then after that, the second time I was wounded, I went back to the United States and convalesced at first Fort Jackson and then Fort Bragg for about 3 months.
Mm-hmm. Steve, I know people often wonder if it's okay to be afraid or scared during combat. How would you answer that?
Well, it's good to be afraid because you think about what you're going to be doing and don't do the bad stuff. And to be scared, everybody's scared. I don't care how tough or what a great ranger you are or what a great soldier. You're scared while you're doing the stuff that you do to do your job.
I know you're proud of what you were able to do during the war, but does it make you feel uneasy when people talk about what a brave thing you did, your actions in combat? Does it make you feel uneasy?
Tom, not so much as uneasy in the sense that I always attribute to everything that happened to a group effort, a teamwork thing that happened.
Right.
I had opportunities to use assets that were provided to me and to apply those assets to make the situation belong to our friendly forces.
Mm-hmm. You've served during a war, obviously, and through the years I'm sure you've seen a few war movies. Zulu, one of them, I think you mentioned. Do you think war is depicted accurately in most of the movies that we see today or are in the past?
Well, my wife will tell you that as soon as I start seeing a movie that I think is not correct, I say, hokey. That's a hokey movie. But I will tell you, there have been recently some very, very good. I haven't seen Fury yet, but I understand that's well done. Saving Private Ryan was a favorite of mine.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Black Hawk Down was right on the money. What went on there was as much in my memory as what happened in Somalia.
What about some of the Vietnamese movies, that were made during or about the Vietnam War? Have you seen a lot of those, and how did you think they were depicted?
Well, we had our John Wayne movie where it was...
Green Berets?
Yes, Green Beret was the title of that, where he was a colonel and he was out in the bush and he was working with the indigenous people, and he had a lot of soldiers around him. There was so much of that was very good, and so much of it that was pure Hollywood. So you had to sit in the movie theater and glean from what was being given you what was pure Hollywood. Actually, it was filmed at Fort Benning and sound studios in Hollywood. And then what was a true reflection of what was going on in Vietnam. And let me say one more thing.
Sure,
please.
go ahead. Yeah.
Our special forces are really special, and the SEALs are great. When you think about everything that's transpired and all the recent news and how things have happened, you can't give enough credit to the people that made those sacrifices to become special forces and SEALs, and the Air Force has an arm that is a special duty. Most of them are medics, and they do a wonderful job. And I know myself that I have been salvaged. I've had my body salvaged from downed aircraft when it was not their job to do it, but they came in and helped that downed aircraft that I was a party with.
Everybody pitches in.
Everybody pitches
time
in.
of need, right.
Yep, really good stuff.
Do you often wonder, would you do it all over again?
Well, I thought about it one time when I asked that very question, and I said, yes, I'd do it over again, because what I was doing was what I was trained to do. It was a function of my instincts went to work based on everything I'd been taught.
Steve, what would you like for young people, especially our students, to learn and hopefully remember from your military experience?
I think I had a great military experience, and even after the military, I had a great experience working with soldiers. I'd tell young people there's 3 things that are terribly important. To get the education and training, I don't care what it's in. Just make sure you're well trained and well educated in whatever endeavor you're after. Second thing is become a member of the team that's exercising that. I know brain surgeons are brain surgeons, but when you look at those operating rooms, there's a load of nurses and technicians and anesthesiologists doing their job. That doctor had to integrate with the team to get the end that they wanted. And then lastly, don't ever give up on something, because the harder you work at something, the more likely you are to be successful. I was an enlisted person. I was trying to become a sergeant major in the United States Army, but I had a master sergeant telling me, you don't want to be a sergeant major. You want to be an officer. Go be a general. I never got to be a general.
Steve, I want to go back, digress, I guess, a little bit about you, what happened following your military service. We didn't touch on this very much. How did you get to come to Huntsville, and what kind of work were you involved with?
Well, as I remarked before, I was in the business, if you would be, of building ranges for soldiers. I always like to say that every weapon system has to have a target, because the soldiers have to train against targets before they go to the field and use them against the enemy. And I don't care what weapon it is, you got to have a target. So right after I left the active duty, I got into the training business, and I got into the ranges, and right out here on Redstone Arsenal, right here in Huntsville, is an office called the Targets Management Office. And they provide targets to the United States Army, to the Marine Corps, and even to the Air Force. And I'm talking about targets that are real Russian tanks, T-80s, can be real moving vehicles, can be paper targets, can be sensitive targets that tell you how many bullets you've shot and where you've hit. So targets are terribly important to the training effort, and I spent 26 years in the training business.
And you're fully retired now?
I'm fully retired. And I'm glad to be in Huntsville. I came up from Orlando, Florida on a job assignment. I had a boss walk into my office one day and said, Steve, I'd like you to go to Huntsville. I said, Huntsville? Well, thank God he asked me to come to Huntsville, because it's been wonderful.
So you're involved with a lot of honeydew projects now?
I am. I am. As a matter of fact, people have asked, why is my hair so long? They knew me when I was totally crew cut. And I told them, well, my wife and I like to give to charities and donations, and I had a sister that almost demanded it. So I got to thinking one day, $25 per haircut every 2 weeks? Look how much money I could donate if I let my hair grow out. And I didn't have much hair anyway.
Steve, thank you so much for participating in our Price of Freedom interview series and allowing us to preserve your military experience for the people of this community. And thank you, Steve, for your service for our country.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to tell my story.
If you'd like more information regarding this interview or any interview in our Military Heritage Series, please contact the Madison County Military Heritage Commission website at mcmhc.org.